So my name's Tom Redfern. I'm a lawyer. I have a small firm in Covent Garden, and we specialise in helping people and businesses from overseas come to set up their businesses and live in the UK. And then as part of that, we help families to work and live as well. So my talk today is on visas available to come into the UK. Tahmina is going to talk about visas into the USA and immigration into the USA. I'm going to talk about bringing people to live and work in the UK. So I don't know how many of you, obviously you're all students here at the moment, but do any, and you may be here on Tier 4 visas, some of you or all of you, and if you are on Tier 4 visas and you're wanting to stay on afterwards, have any of you looked into what that might entail in terms of visas?
We did some surveys. People have a lot of questions, but they're sent it in, which are, do they have to take a visa? Do they need to, is the tax system going to change for them? Or are they going to have to pay money to get visa to come in? These are the common questions.
Okay.
And the other one is, once they finish studying, how do they settle here?
Okay.
If they want to, now that Brexit's in place, what would be the...
Okay, well that will be in here somewhere, and obviously you can ask, you're very, very welcome to ask questions as we go along. So these visas that are listed here are all, the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 are work visas, as is the sole rep visa, and then the business visitor visa / tourist visa, and then mentioned Brexit and EU citizens, but Dermot is going to be talking very knowledgeably about all of that as well, I think. Now, Tier 1, so Tier 4, as I said, is for students, and that's what a lot of you guys have. And then there's Tier 1, there's Tier 2, Tier 3, and Tier 5. Tier 3 doesn't exist, but it's there. We'd like you to come in after Brexit if we end up with a low-skill work visa, because at the moment, Tier 1 and Tier 2 are to do with highly skilled workers. So the system of visas into the UK, work visas, are geared, apart from for the students, which are Tier 4, to the Tier 1 and Tier 2 to highly skilled workers. Now, for Tier 1, that is all to do with self-employed people. Tier 2 is for employed people. So Tier 1 is self-employed people. So if, for example, you had a great idea and you wanted to start a business in the UK with that great idea, first of all, you need money, I guess. Well, you need the idea first of all, you need money, and then you need the right to work in the UK. And the way you would do that normally would be with this Tier 1 visa. And the Tier 1 visa is split into 4 different types of visas. Startup visa and the innovator visa are brand new. They've only just come in. They came in at the end of March. The investor visa is for people with lots and lots and lots of money, and has been around for a long time. And then there is the exceptional talent visa, which is also possibly of interest to anybody wanting to be able to stay. You've got to have exceptional talent for it. These slides, I think, will be available to you afterwards, so you're very welcome to share in those afterwards. But the startup visa is for somebody who doesn't have any experience of having a job and a business in the UK. And it doesn't need you to have any funding behind you to be able to get this visa. But what you have to have is you have to have an innovative idea, and the business that you're going to be making and doing in the UK has to be viable, which means it has to be something that's going to make money, and it has to be scalable, which means that it has to be a business that's going to be able to grow. This visa is brand new, and you have to have it endorsed by an endorsing body. The government has just introduced this visa, and unfortunately it hasn't got in place the endorsing bodies ready to endorse. There are 25 or so endorsing bodies, and a lot of them, like Tech Nation, which is in Tech City, an endorsing body says it won't be ready till September. But essentially, without the endorsing body, you're not going to be able to get this type of visa. But on the other side, on the positive side, you don't need any funding, you don't need lots of money behind you. You don't have to show that you've got lots of money. You are going to show that you've got £945 of maintenance, for maintenance. That means that you've got to have £945 in your bank account for 90 days, every day of 90 days, before you submit your application for this. Or you've got to wait that time. You won't be able to shorten that time, you've got to wait that 90 days. Now, if you're a student and you've got a Tier 4 visa, your course is likely to finish a few weeks before your visa is going to finish. And once your visa finishes, you have to go, unless you have some other kind of visa that's going to take its place. And obviously this is one type of visa that would enable you to stay on in the UK. Otherwise you're going to have to leave, go back to your home country, and you're then going to have to apply from your home country to come back to the UK with all the expense and the hassle that involves. But maybe that's the only way you're going to be able to do it. So, startup visa, great visa, it's for 2 years. The bad news is it doesn't lead to settlement, so you have no settlement rights. It allows you to carry on in the UK for 2 years. The innovator visa is for more experienced workers. It allows people from the startup visa to transfer into the innovator visa. This visa is for 3 years. Again, you have the requirement of needing £945 for 90 days beforehand. It requires funding of £50,000. A lot of money. The visa that it replaced used to require funding of £200,000, so this is a positive gesture from the government in that it's reduced the sum that you need, because that was a barrier obviously to a lot of people, £200,000 down to £50,000. It's still a lot of money, but essentially if you're transferring from the startup visa, hopefully in that 2-year period, you may be able to produce money to be able to afford to do that. Or you found somebody who you can convince, like an accelerator, in one of the cities, if you're doing a tech invention of some kind, an app, you might be able to get some money from one of the accelerators which goes towards the £50,000, or you've got family or friends who can lend you that money. But this visa, at the end of the 3 years, will allow you to settle in the UK, provided you meet certain conditions. Now, normally, to be able to live visa-free in the UK, you have to live legally in the UK for 5 years of working, 10 years for naturalisation, because the time that you have here as a student doesn't count for the 5 years of working. So if you do a 1, 2, 3, 4-year course as a student, none of that is going to count towards getting residence and being visa-free in the UK. The only way you can count that time as a student will be towards the 10 years of naturalisation. So if you do one course which lasts 3 years, undergraduate, you then go to a postgraduate course, do another year, 2 years, 3 years, and say you stay in the university system for 6 years, and then you go and get a job for 4 years, then that 10 years will allow you to get to naturalisation. And of course, the other way, I say of course, the other way of getting to be visa-free is via the Love visa. And the Love visa means finding a UK or currently an EU partner and being able to basically take advantage of the relationship that you have with that person. You need to be living with the person for 2 years in the UK, or alternatively you need to be married to that person. And if you happen to have known the person for 1 week before you get married, then that's likely not to be very good, because you'll end up with the department known as the sham marriage department looking into your relationship. Anyway, coming back to the innovator visa, it's a great visa because it's only 3 years to get to visa free. Normally it's 5 years, but this is 3 years. So if you jump, forget about the startup visa, you happen to have a business, you happen to have £50,000, you happen to get it endorsed, you can go straight into this. 3 years later, provided you meet the conditions, you can apply for indefinite leave to remain, ILR, or in the US terminology, the green card. The investor visa is for millionaires or children of millionaires, because it enables you to basically lend 2 million, 5 million or 10 million pounds to the UK. You get the money back at the end, but during that time you can live in the UK, and at the end of that time you can get your indefinite leave to remain. And the final one, exceptional talent, this is becoming increasingly popular. Again, these are for self-employed people. So with exceptional talent, what that means is that you have a talent and it's exceptional, and that is your worth to the nation. You have 5 different endorsing bodies that you can go to apply for endorsement as having exceptional talent. And those include tech, humanities, engineering, science, and the arts. So if you have an exceptional talent in any of those 5 areas, and you have third-party evidence for that, because that's what you're going to need, then you can apply for this endorsement of exceptional talent, and if you get that endorsement, then you can apply for the visa. And the visa will be for 3 years, and you can apply for indefinite leave after that. You can also apply for an exceptional promise visa. Now, promise is where it's a bit like the spring. It's something to look forward to in the future, the summer. With exceptional promise, it means you've got talent that you are going to be having. They believe in you. They think you're going to be able to prove your worth over the coming years. Talent is where you've already done it. So the funding, you don't need any funding, but you do need exceptional talent. So those are the tier 1s. Those are the self-employed routes. People who don't want to go and work for somebody else, feel that they've got a great idea and basically want to set up their own business. Brave people. But it's the way people like to be, self-employed. Tier 2 is where you're going to be employed by somebody. Now, for a lot of people, for the majority of people, this is how you're going to move from your Tier 4 visa to be able to carry on in the UK, assuming you're not in a relationship with somebody and you're able to do it via the love visa. The Tier 2 sponsor license requires you to basically go and find a company that has a sponsor license that is prepared to sponsor you, to work for that company. So if you go for an interview for a job, one of the questions that you may find, or if you go to a recruiter, one of the things they're going to ask is, what's your nationality? And if you're an EU citizen at the moment, you do not need any kind of visa to be able to work in the UK. And that is the way that will stay as well, provided the withdrawal agreement goes through, because of the transition period through to the 31st of December 2020. That's the current rule. But at the moment, we are in Remain, and anybody who is from the EU can stay in the UK, live in the UK, work in the UK perfectly legally. However, anybody outside of the EU, and after Brexit, EU people are going to need to work for somebody that has a sponsor license. Now, there is on the government, on the web, there is a public list of every single company in the UK that has a sponsor license. So you can, and it's a long list, alphabetical order, but you can go on to that public register and check to see if there are particular companies that you want to apply to see whether they have a sponsor license already. We do have examples of people who are basically wanting to work for a particular employer, small employer, but the employer does not have a sponsor license, but is prepared to invest in a sponsor license for the specific purpose of employing that particular person. And obviously the big issue for them is how much is it going to cost? Because normally, with a company looking to sponsor migrants, the company will pay the visa fees, normally speaking. But in a situation where an individual is trying to persuade a company to employ them and they do not have the right passport and they need a sponsor license, they are then into a negotiation with the company about how that cost of the sponsor license and the visa is going to be met. Is the company prepared to pay all of it or some of it? Is the individual prepared to pay all of it or some of it? There are two types of visas. Once you have a sponsor license, once the company has a sponsor license, there are two types of visa that you can, as an individual, apply for. One is called general, and the other is called intercompany transfer, or ICT. There is a major difference between the two. The major difference being that the general visa leads to settlement. You can apply for settlement. The other one, ICT, does not lead to settlement. The general is harder to get. There has to be advertising done of that. So if you go to a company and you say, I'd like to apply for the job, and they say yes, and you're not an EU citizen or a UK citizen, then they have to advertise the job, or to have advertised the job for a month, and have decided that there is nobody suitable. They have to decide that there is nobody suitable for that job, then they can offer you that role. But if you're coming via Tier 2 General, as I say, if you've gone outside your Tier 4 visa, in terms of you've gone past the end date on it, you're going to have to apply from your home country for that visa. The intercompany transfer visa would apply to companies like BP, Shell, big companies, Google, LinkedIn, anybody that's really big, Apple, where you're working for that company overseas and then you're looking to come to the UK. In your particular situation, that isn't going to happen, but if you happen to go back to your home country or to another country and work for them there, then you can come to the UK with this visa. It's quite quick to get. You can get it in a week, but you will never have residence rights. The only way you can get residence rights is by moving to the love visa, which I keep on mentioning. The sole representative visa is for, if you find an overseas business, or you're talking to somebody from, for example, your home country, and you say, look, I'm the right guy, I'm here, I can set up your business in the UK for you. Then what you might be able to do is persuade them to apply for you to have this sole representative visa. This is a one-off, one-time work visa. It's probably the simplest visa of all the visas that there is. You're employed by the company overseas, but you're able to, you're here to develop the UK business for them. It's a one-off chance that you get. And it does lead to residence and settlement, 5 years. It's for 3 years, then you can apply for an extension for 2 years. It's a good visa to get, and it hasn't been touched through all the changes that the UK government have been making with the immigration process in the last 10 years and continue to make. As I said, with settlement, indefinite leave to remain is available after 5 years. But during that time, you mustn't be out of the country for more than 6 months. And there must be a gap of more than 6 months between your absences from the UK. So that's the normal way for getting settlement. And the same applies to a spouse visa. If you get a spouse visa or a partner visa, you have to have the visa for 5 years before you can basically be here applying for indefinite leave to remain. And one story that I have on that spouse visa, so I had an Australian individual who fell out with his partner, and she left Canadian. He was Australian, she was Canadian, but she had a work visa for the UK, and so was in the UK legally, and he had his visa dependent on her visa. They fell out, she left the country, he didn't realise that his visa depended on her visa, he went on holiday skiing, arrived back at the border on the 1st of January, and because it was the 1st of January and he was with his brother, the border people said to him, looked at his visa, said, see, you've got a spouse visa, partner visa, where's your partner? To which he said, we fell out, she's gone back to Canada. He was given 14 days to leave the country. His job up in smoke, unfortunately. And that's basically saying, it's all very well having a spouse visa, but once you've got the spouse visa, you've got to stay with the spouse or the partner for the period of the 5 years. And if you split up, that is the end of your spouse or partner visa. So it's not just a matter of getting the visa, you've got to work not only at the visa, you've got to work at the relationship for the period of the 5 years as well. It's, it's the cases that basically show what madness is about it. And the other thing to say about passports is that people think of airports as the place where you're going to have the checks done the most on you as you enter the country for the first time. Well, that may be true, but the place that we find where people get sent back to their home country from the most is Gare du Nord, Paris. Basically, people go for a weekend, a short break on the train through to France with their non-EU passport, and they may be here visiting, and then they come back to Paris to come to the UK, and the question asked is, why are you going back to the UK when your visa is simply for tourism? And they say, well, because my place is in the UK, and they get said, you're not allowed to do that. You have to go and basically go into your own place. You need to have the right visa to be able to live here and to work here. So you need to be clear about that. To get a British passport, you have to do an extra year on top of the 5 years. So indefinite leave to remain allows you to be visa-free on your own passport, and you can carry on like that forever, provided you keep coming back to the UK. But if you want a British passport, then you need to stay an extra year, and you cannot leave the country for more than 90 days in that extra year, and then you can apply for the British passport. And most countries in the world will allow you to have more than one passport. There are a few countries that will not allow you to have more than one passport. Having two passports is quite a good thing, in my opinion, and there are a lot of people currently applying for Irish passports because of Brexit, or for EU passports, and if they happen to be related to somebody from the EU, just so that if we end up in the post-Brexit situation, life will be relatively simple to get into and out of the rest of Europe. The business visitor visa, or the tourist visa, is essentially for anybody wanting to come for tourism or business, so it's not work. W is the work visa. Business tourism is basically where you want to come to the UK simply as a tourist or as a business visitor. This should be a relatively simple visa to get, although just this morning I had a client in who said that they have somebody who's been rejected 3 times for the tourist visa because they didn't have enough funds, couldn't show that they had enough funds to be able to get into the UK. If you're coming from the USA or Canada or several Commonwealth countries, then you can come in visa-free. But for many, many countries, you need a visa to be able to come in. And the visa will be stamped for 6 months. If you're coming from somewhere like Turkey, you can get a multiple trip visa for up to 10 years. But the visa is for up to 6 months, but the idea the example of the person going to Paris would be on this type of visa, going to Paris and then wanting to come back in, but it's on a tourist visa while you're coming back to the UK. Finally, Brexit, very briefly. The 29th of March Brexit date didn't happen. We don't know when the new date will be. EU nationals at the moment can live and work legally in the UK, and that's going to carry on. The only way in which it wouldn't carry on is if we crash out without a deal. But if we crash out without a deal, the government has already said that for at least 3 months after that time, people will be able to stay and live in the UK, and then they'll have to put something else in place. But the current thinking of the government is that we're not crashing out, although I'm sure Dermot will go into this in some more detail. I've explained that the visa system that exists in the UK at the moment is for highly skilled workers. Post-Brexit, we're going to need a low-skill worker visa as well, because we have lots and lots of people who currently do great jobs in coffee shops, in hospitals, as in the agricultural industry. And if they're not going to be able to come in from Europe without a visa, they're going to have to be giving them a visa to be able to come in. But how that system will work, I have no idea. And how many people are going to want to do it on a temporary basis because that low-skill visa is not going to lead to settlement, I don't know either. So I sense trouble ahead on that front, but that's one of just very, very many pieces of trouble that is on the horizon if and when we leave the UK. So that's my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
The organisers, including my sister Tamanna, for the invitation. You know, a lot of the discussions that have happened here is really why I'm here. My background is I grew up here, was born and raised, and then I went to Brunel University to do my law degree. And then I went to somewhere called the Inns of Court School of Law to do my to go to law school. I did my pupillage here in the UK, and I had then met my now husband and moved to the United States. I live in Seattle, Washington. I took the New York bar exams and I started to practice immigration law in the US. And I started my own firm in 2009. I had moved in 2005. And my practice focuses on business immigration primarily, although I do help individuals as well in family-based immigration. I wanted to mention this book I have written called The Startup Visa. Tom had mentioned the Startup Visa. The US does not have a startup visa, and one of the, early on when I moved to the US and I started to practice, the recession had hit quite badly, and a lot of immigrants were losing their jobs who wanted to start their own businesses, and that sort of propelled my path into policy that eventually took me to work with, well, I didn't go there personally, but I was a very small clog, a little tiny piece in Hillary Clinton's immigration team when she was running for office. And so I've been very fortunate to have a background in practice as well as policy that has given me a name in the US when it comes to immigration law. So I'm here because, you know, Brexit, I think, has brought up this issue of where do immigrants in the UK go? Are they going back to their own countries? Are they going back to Europe? Or could they possibly explore their options to go to the United States? And so when it comes to the United States, in the United States, there are primarily two grounds. There's family-based immigration and employment-based immigration. And there is this sort of, you know, tourist and short-term issues, and I'm going to touch on all of those a little, but primarily talk about employment-based visa categories. But before I go there, I'm going to talk about some of the temporary visa categories that some of you might be considering if you wanted to explore your options to go to the United States. So, just like Tom mentioned, there is a tourist visa / business visa that is applicable to the United States as well. And whereas everything here has a tier 1, Tier 2 label to it. In the United States, visas have levels. So the student visa is, the tourist visa is B1/B2, and you would apply for it at the local embassy. You may get a multiple entry visa that might be valid for 10 years, but you get to stay in the United States only 6 months at a time. I'm not going to go into the vast details of these visas, but essentially know that you can go, visit, stay for 6 months, come back, but you do need to prove that you have ties to the US or wherever your home is. British citizens actually have a very nice privilege called visa waiver. So as long as you get background clearance, your UK passport would allow you to go to the United States for 90 days at a time. So for students, it's a good way to explore your options in the US, whether you want to continue to study perhaps. And the popular visas, most popular visa is something called an F1. So anybody who's an international student in the US will have an F1 instead of the Tier 4 that Tom mentioned, or you probably have yourselves. But there are a couple of other visas that I wanted to mention. There's something called an M visa, and that's for vocational study. I don't typically deal with that, so I couldn't tell you all the details about it, but it is an option. But J visas. J visas are popular. You've often heard about au pairs going to the United States. Residents, medical residents normally use it. It's essentially a training visa. So if you're going to be an intern somewhere, you could potentially look at the J visa. Now, this is typically sponsored by the employer. So let's say you're going to get training in a video company. I just did a visa for somebody. And you would typically get the employer to work with the agency that will deal with the J visa. Now, in the US, most visas are applied for either with the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, otherwise known as USCIS, or you apply at the embassy, depending on what kind of visa it is. The F1 is applied for at the embassy. J visas are sort of a little bit of a visa category on its own, whereas it is applied for at the embassy, but an agency will deal with it. It's generally called a cultural exchange program. And so these exchange agencies will exist and you go to them. And so whenever somebody comes to me, I ask the employer to go to the agency and they will help with that. But it's a very viable visa category for a lot of people trying to explore their options to see what it's like to live and work in the United States. And it's valid initially for 18 months. You have to be careful, some countries, citizens of some countries will have a residency rule attached to it for 2 years, that if you have finished your J visa, you have to go back to your home country for 2 years before you can come back to the United States and something else. It's a very viable option, so it's if somebody's looking for a way to temporarily try it out, it's relatively quick and easy to get. The training visa is also, there's something called an H3 visa, and the H3 visa is applied for with United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and this is something that the lawyer would actually prepare. And the employer would generally create a training program. So whereas the exchange agency will have had a training program that would generally fit the employer's needs and vice versa, and they can work on it, when it comes to an H3, the employer has to put a lot of time on their own to create a program. And it can be up to 18 months in one go, but up to 2 years is the validity of this visa. And then if you do use the entire 2 years, you have to go back to your home country for 6 months before you can try something else. But it's often a visa that's used to bridge a gap between a student and employment visas. And a lot of my clients will look at it as a backup option if they can't get the work visa that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So employment-based visas, first question is why would you even consider it? Often people don't have family members in the United States to sponsor them for, to live and work there for what's called a green card. In the UK, it's called leave to remain, I believe. Is that leave to remain? And in the US, it's called a green card. And so you don't have a family-based option. The family-based options also take a long time. Currently, under this administration, everything is taking about 2 years if you're married. If your parents are sponsoring you, it can take a lot longer. If you have a sibling sponsoring you, forget it. It's about 10, 15 years for that. And so an employment-based option will get you to the US rather quickly. Now, the starter visa, I told you that we don't have one. There have been bills in Congress for about a decade, but we haven't got one. But read my book, you will have some of the options that will be available that I'm going to talk about. So some of the common visas, Tom mentioned something called an intercompany transfer. We call it an L1 visa. And it can be for somebody who's a manager or an executive, but it can also be somebody who's worked at the business for some time and has special knowledge for it. The E2 visa is something that I like quite a lot. It allows somebody to invest in their own company or partner with somebody, but own at least 51%. And move to the US relatively quickly as well. And you don't have an employer, you can have complete control over your own destiny for that. H-1B visa, that's the most popular work visa in the United States. There are 65,000 visas that are given out each year, 20,000 additional visas that are reserved for people who have a master's degree from a United States school, and you apply once a year. So the quota starts at the beginning of the fiscal year, October 1, but you can apply 6 months in advance. So April 1st is when most people would be applying for this visa. But typically an employer has to file for it. If you have your own business, it's also possible to file an H-1B, but it's a very difficult part. It's absolutely possible, but typically the employer would file for it. Tom had mentioned exceptional talent. In the US, we call it extraordinary ability. This is the O visa, also dubbed as a genius visa. And generally speaking, you would want to have an employer sponsor you, but an agent could also do it. So often when you see all these movie stars, the celebrities going to the US, they're probably using an O1 visa because it needs to show that you have critical acclaim in your industry. But it doesn't have to be celebrity. It could be in the arts, in the sciences, and so forth. And so there are other specific employment visas as well. E3 visas, these are country specific actually. The E3 visa is specifically for citizens of Australia. The criteria is very similar to the H-1B for high-skilled workers, but the E3 is very nice. If you're, first time anybody who says I'm from Australia, it's like, oh my, great. There are no quotas, or at least if there is a quota, it's not met. So it's relatively quick and easy to get. I mentioned the O already, and there's the Treaty NAFTA Professional Workers Visa. And this visa is specifically reserved for people from Canada and Mexico. But with all the tumultuous negotiations going on in the US with the United States and Mexico and Canada, the NAFTA treaty is being revised, and it's got a new name. I forget what it's called. US, it's a different name. So it's been negotiated, and once that treaty goes into effect, we'll see what happens to the visa categories. So the L1, I'm going to dive a little bit more into each of these categories. The L1 is if you have a business in the UK or anywhere else in the world actually, and you have worked at that company for at least 1 year out of the last 3 years, your position is that of an executive or a manager, or if you have specialized knowledge, you can come to the US. Now the business has to prove that it has an affiliation with the US entity, so they have to have either shared ownership or the business has to own the US entity or vice versa. The total amount of time on that visa would be 7 years for an executive or a manager, or 5 years for somebody who has specialized knowledge. So when I live in the land of Amazon and Microsoft, and or Boeing, and all these companies are multinational companies. And so they're moving people around so often, and these are the visa categories they will often use. The application process is that you have to apply in the United States, the employer has to file it, and eventually you get a visa stamp in your passport, and that allows you to go to the US. The E1 and E2, I did mention E1 before, but it's part of the same treaty. So the United States will have treaties with various countries, and if you're from one of those countries, and the UK is one of them, you can utilize this particular visa category. So China, India, there are other countries that do not have these treaties, and therefore those citizens do not have the ability to apply for this visa category. It's a very nice visa category where you can come to the US relatively quickly, and if you have a business idea, you know, it's a good way to explore your options. But it does allow, so investor visas, the E2 visa is essentially an investor visa. You have to show that you're investing in a business that is going to create jobs. The US doesn't necessarily care how many jobs you're going to create. The law does not dictate how many, at least for this visa category. You have to have a business plan that shows that you are going to create jobs. And the other important part of this particular visa category is that you have to show where your money came from. Now, the law doesn't dictate how much money you invest. There is a different visa category that I'll mention that does say so, but $100,000 is a rule of thumb. Now, these days, a lot of startup founders will say, well, I can just have a computer and a phone and be in my basement and voila, there's a Facebook-like company that, you know, comes from that, that's generating $1 million. But the laws in the United States were from the 1990s. Actually, they were based on the 1950s. And so everything is looked upon with these archaic eyes, where you have to do things traditionally. You do need an office space. You need to be able to show photographs and a lease agreement. And so when you apply for an E2 visa, you have to show that the business is ready to run, and it's going to be operating as soon as you get that visa category. But really, there's no minimum investment amount. It has to be proportionate to the business. So I try not to brag about this, but I had a client who was from Europe, and we managed to get a visa for him where he invested $30,000 only. And it's rather unheard of to invest such little. But with tech companies, you don't really need a lot of money. So it depends on where you are and what your needs are and what your comfort level is and what your business is. So if you're buying a hair salon, $50,000 might do it, but if you're buying a hotel, you know, it's going to be several hundred, if not millions of dollars. So it's proportionate. So that's an E2 visa. Unlike the L1, it must be applied for at the embassy, wherever your home country is. So in the UK, for example, and each country will have some of its own nuances. So in the UK, when you apply for an E2 visa, the embassy actually wants to see that you live here. So you have to provide residency information as well. Whereas, for example, when we applied for this client I mentioned for the 30,000, it was in Amsterdam, and they don't really care whether you necessarily live there. So depending on where your home country is, your rules will differ slightly accordingly. Now, the H-1B visa I mentioned, it's the most popular work visa because I live in Seattle. There are a lot of tech companies there who are looking for high-skilled workers. And so we apply for this. It's applied for, I mentioned, April 1st, and it is subject to the lottery. So when people are applying, over 200 applications were filed just this year, whereas there are only 85,000 visas available. So it is actually a lottery system. And in fact, I'm still hearing about cases that have been selected. And next year, this system is going to go through a very big overhaul, whereas the lottery is going to become a pre-selection lottery. So you only apply with simple information, and once you're selected, you'll be able to submit the full petition. For self-employed, if you're a startup founder, you have to show that the business actually dictates your work. So one of the big things in an H-1B is employer-employee relationship. And over the last 2 years, particularly under this administration, the scrutiny has become significantly higher. But when you're a startup founder, as long as you can show that there is a board of directors or you have other shareholders and they're controlling your work, and they have the authority to hire, fire, and supervise you, you could potentially meet that requirement. The H-1B also has a specific requirement to show that you are getting the minimum wage for that particular job in that particular area. Now, America is rather large. There's the East Coast, West Coast, and everywhere in the middle, and the wages differ. So let's say a doctor, the Department of Labor says a doctor in New York must earn at least $90,000. But somewhere in the middle, let's say Kansas City, the Department of Labor might say they must get $60,000. And so H-1Bs have this particular need, and there are prerequisite documents to file to prove that the employer is going to be paying that particular salary. In terms of green cards, I haven't really talked about the various other green cards that are stepping stones from the temporary work visas I just mentioned. The L has a similarly situated green card path. The O1 also has a green card path. The E2 doesn't, and this is where this particular visa comes in that I'm going to talk about. And so typically what people do in the US is you want to get there temporarily somehow. So you have a foot in the door and then think about the green card. Because the green card process in the US is significantly long. Minimum 2 years, and under the Trump administration everything is taking longer. Under the guise of extreme vetting, people who didn't used to have interviews to get a green card are now getting interviews, and thereby the process has become prolonged. So the EB-5, it's a bit like what Tom mentioned on the investor visa. A lot of people from China do this particular visa, but people from the UK actually are one of the higher numbers in the statistics for getting this visa as well. Now, unlike the UK that Tom mentioned, that the investor will give the money to the UK government, the US requires the investor to invest in a job-creating entity. And you have to prove at the beginning of this process that your money has come from lawful sources or a source, and the investment amount is dictated. It has to be at least $500,000, and that could change under this administration. And the $500,000 is what I call a poor area. A poor area is generally, the real word is targeted employment area, with high unemployment or a rural area. And then $1 million is the other investment amount, which is anywhere that's not poor. And you have to show that you're, at the time of investment, that the money is lawful and it arrived from the US in a lawful manner and it was invested in the actual entity, and that you have a promise of creating 10 jobs. The process takes about 2.5 years to get the green card. And when you get the green card, it's only valid for 2 years. 2 years later, you have to prove to the government that those 10 jobs that you promised were actually created. And so under this visa category, just one person, the principal family member, can apply with $500,000, and everybody in the family, children up to 21, will get the green card. So it's actually very popular, and interestingly enough, up until about 2007, this visa was not used very much. But when the recession had hit, banks were not giving money as easily as they were, and so the construction industry had actually gone to China to see, well, let's see if we can get investors, and it was a wonderful match for them that investors were, coming from there. But over the course of the years, and there is a quota for this particular category, China had basically used the visas to such an extent that there is a long backlog in getting this green card. So it's interesting that the people who are advertising this, for example, are actually going to the Indian subcontinent, particularly India, because the H-1B visa that's been used in the US is generally used with a very high proportion from Indian citizens. And so there is a long policy discussion behind it, but the EB-5 visa category is essentially a lot more popular in the last few years than it has been. the types of EB5, I said direct and indirect, and I say the 10 jobs. Typically, the core area visas that I mentioned, targeted employment area, those investments are done through something called regional centres. And the regional centres will have the responsibility of showing the jobs. But you could, in fact, invest in your own business. It could be your own, company, or, as long as it's got a promise of 10 jobs. You could invest in your own company so that you have complete control. Where you have your company will dictate whether you are in the 500 or the million zone, but it's typically it could be two-pronged, either with the regional centres or in your own company. And so the advantages are that for UK citizens or even European citizens, there's no waiting time, unlike people from China or India or Mexico or some of these countries that, citizens go to the US a lot, and they've taken they've used their visa allotment a lot. Children and spouses are used. If you have children, and a lot of people, just like Tom mentioned, a lot of wealthy people try to get their children these visas so that they can have the green card, they have the stability, the security of living somewhere, and they can pay in-state tuition. Now, in the US, which I think the education system is very different, tuition fees are in the 100,000s often, and so this is a huge benefit for those who are looking to get their children into schools. And so once you have the green card, by the way, you're free to live anywhere, and you can have it forever. You don't necessarily have to be a US citizen, although it's advocated that you do. But you do have to renew the green card every 10 years. And so I mentioned regional centres. I won't go into that. These slides will be handed out. And so you can learn about it. I'm running out of time. And so, EB5 is for those who have no other option but to have some funds to be able to have the flexibility to move to the US. Now, the US, as you might read in the news, we are going through some similar issues. And whether, we have the same president in the next, 6 years or not, the US is likely to be a destiny for a place of interest for, people from around the world. And the economy is booming and businesses are doing well. So what I see in my practice are when people go with the intent of having a business, and we do see our clients' business plans, that they actually often exceed their expectations. I had a client where, and we're getting their green card at the moment, their business plan had said in the next 5 years they're going to make about $10 million. They're actually in the 20 before that plan had actually gone into place. So the economy is booming, people are hiring, and if Brexit is a concern for you and you're wondering where to go, the United States may be somewhere that could be in your future. So thank you so much for having me, really appreciate it.